Picture a narrow street in the heart of Paris in the year 1719. It is barely wide enough to walk down, and yet it is packed shoulder to shoulder with a heaving, delirious crowd. Dukes beside dock workers, countesses beside their own coachmen, all of them screaming numbers at one another and clutching slips of printed paper as if their lives depended on it. And in a sense, they do, because those slips of paper are making them rich. Not slowly, not modestly, but overnight, beyond anything they had ever dared to imagine. Fortunes are being conjured out of thin air on this street, hour by hour. Servants are becoming wealthier than the masters they served that morning. It is a fever, a mania, a miracle. And it is all flowing from the mind of a single man. That man was not a French statesman. He was not a nobleman or a royal financier or anyone the court would ever have chosen. He was a Scotsman, a professional gambler, and, most remarkably of all, he was a convicted murderer. A man who had killed his opponent in a duel, been sentenced to death for it, and escaped from prison to flee across Europe with a price on his head. He was a convicted murderer on the run when the French crown handed him control of its entire money supply. His name was John Law, and for one dizzying year, this fugitive killer would become, by many measures, the single most powerful man in France. Richer than princes, courted by the highest in the land, the master of the nation's money, its debt, its trade, and its treasury, all at once. Now, if this story is remembered at all today, it is remembered as a quaint 18th century swindle, a strange old bubble, a curiosity from a powdered wig world with no bearing on our own. That could not be more wrong. Because what John Law built on that Paris street was not a mere scam. It was the birth of the modern financial system. Paper money, a central bank, a stock market, and a national debt. All wired together for the very first time in history into a single machine by this one brilliant and reckless man. Every financial bubble that has come since, every crash you have ever heard of, is a rerun of what he did first. He did not just run a con. He invented the world we all still live inside. And then he showed us, in the most spectacular way imaginable, exactly how it breaks. Sit with the strangeness of that for a moment. For 1 year, the most powerful man in one of the greatest kingdoms on earth was a foreign fugitive with a death sentence to his name. And the system he built to climb that high is the direct ancestor of every banknote in your wallet and every number in your bank account. This is not a footnote. This is where our entire financial world begins. Which raises the questions this whole story exists to answer. How does a condemned killer, running from the hangman, end up in command of an economy the size of a modern great power? How do you build a machine that appears to create limitless wealth out of nothing but paper and belief? And if that machine worked so miraculously, if it made an entire nation rich almost overnight, then why did it turn, within months, and annihilate not only the fortunes of a country, but the man who created it? And let me be clear about what this is, because a story this outlandish invites disbelief. This is not a legend, and I am not exaggerating for effect. Every improbable turn of it is documented, sober financial history. You can read it in Janet Gleason's biography of Law, aptly titled Millionaire, and in the detailed scholarly work of the economist Antoine Murphy, who spent a career reconstructing exactly what Law did and how. And here's the detail that should reframe the whole thing before we even begin. The great economist Joseph Schumpeter, one of the finest minds ever to study money, later placed John Law in the very front rank of monetary theorists of all time. This was not a fool. This was a genius who happened to be playing with fire. If you want the hidden financial history that explains the world you actually live in, the machinery underneath the money, this is the channel built to give it to you. So consider subscribing, and let's go back to the beginning. Because to understand how one man could seize control of a kingdom's money, you first have to understand two things: the desperate state France was in when he arrived, and the strange, dangerous idea he had been carrying in his head across Europe for the better part of 20 years. John Law was born in Edinburgh in the early 1670s, and he was, in a sense, born into money. Though not the kind that made a man respectable. His family were goldsmiths, and in that era, a goldsmith was often also a banker. They held other people's gold for safekeeping, they lent it out, they dealt in credit and coin. So the young John Law grew up surrounded by the mechanics of money, by ledgers and loans, and the strange truth, which he absorbed early, that a piece of paper promising gold could pass from hand to hand as if it were the gold itself. He was also, from a young age, brilliant with numbers. Gifted, quick, and possessed of a genuine mathematical mind, the kind that could calculate odds in his head faster than other men could think. And he put that gift to use in the least respectable way imaginable. He became a gambler. He moved to London as a young man, cut a dashing figure, dressed extravagantly, chased women, and made his living at the gaming tables, where his grasp of probability gave him a lasting edge over less careful men. Over the years at the tables of London and the continent, he did not merely win pocket money. He built a genuine fortune, often by taking the banker's side in games of chance where a cool head and a command of the odds handed the house a permanent advantage. He was charming, elegant, persuasive, and quietly ruthless. A man who grasped, better than almost anyone alive, that money and risk were not two separate things, but two faces of the same coin. But recklessness of that kind has a way of catching up with a man. In 1694, John Law fought a duel in London against another man named Edward Wilson, reportedly over the affections of a woman. Law killed him. And in the eyes of the law, a killing in a duel was not an affair of honor. It was murder. He was arrested, tried, convicted, and sentenced to death. That should have been the end of the story. It very nearly was, but Law was resourceful and well-connected enough to find help, and before the sentence could be carried out, he escaped from prison and fled England altogether. He crossed to the continent, a wanted man, a convicted murderer with a death sentence hanging over him that would follow him for the rest of his life. And here is where the story takes its crucial turn, the turn that separates John Law from every other fugitive gambler in history. He did not simply run and hide and drink away his years in exile. Across the next 2 decades, as he moved from city to city, Amsterdam, Paris, Venice, Genoa, supporting himself at the gaming tables, he was also doing something else. He was studying. Obsessively, brilliantly, he studied the way money worked in the most advanced financial centers of Europe. He examined the great Bank of Amsterdam. He studied the newly founded Bank of England. He watched how credit moved, how paper circulated, how trade rose and fell with the supply of money. And out of all that study, he assembled a theory, a complete, radical, and genuinely original theory of money and national wealth. It was an idea so far ahead of its time that it would take the world nearly 2 more centuries to fully accept it. And for years, John Law tried to sell that idea to the governments of Europe. He proposed it to his native Scotland, which turned him down. He offered it to others, who dismissed him as a dangerous crank with a criminal past. No respectable government would touch him or his scheme. And then, at last, the timing became perfect. Because he found a country that had run out of every other option. He found a country that was going broke. The country was France. And in the year 1715, France was, for all its glittering splendor, on the edge of financial ruin. The great King Louis XIV, the Sun King, the very symbol of French grandeur, had just died after a reign of more than 70 years. And he had left behind a magnificent kingdom that was also quietly, catastrophically broke. Decades of near-constant, ruinously expensive wars had drained the treasury and buried the French state under a mountain of debt so vast that the interest alone was swallowing the government whole. the crown was effectively insolvent. It owed far more than it could ever hope to repay, and the confidence of its creditors had collapsed. French government debt was trading at a deep discount, regarded as barely more reliable than a broken promise. The Regent's government had already tried the usual desperate remedies, and none of them had worked. It hauled the financiers and tax collectors who had grown fat on the old king's wars before a special court, hoping to squeeze fines out of them. It cut the value of parts of its own debt by simple decree, effectively cheating some of the very people it had borrowed from. These were the crude tools of a state that had run clean out of ideas, and they only thickened the atmosphere of mistrust. France did not need another patch. It needed something entirely new. Because Louis XV was only a small child, France was now governed by a regent, Philippe, the Duke of Orléans, who ruled in the boy king's name. And the Duke of Orléans was, in several ways, exactly the man John Law had been waiting his whole life to meet. He was intelligent, curious, and unusually open to radical ideas. He was himself something of a gambler and a libertine, unafraid of scandal. And crucially, he already knew John Law personally. The two men had crossed paths in the gambling world years before. Here, at last, was a ruler with the power to say yes, a desperate financial crisis that demanded a bold solution and a personal willingness to gamble on an unconventional man. So what exactly was the idea Law brought to him? At its heart lay a single revolutionary claim. For all of human history, people had believed that a nation's wealth was its store of gold and silver, that money was, by its nature, the precious metal a country held, and that this was necessarily scarce and fixed. John Law argued that this was profoundly wrong. Money, he insisted, was not gold. Money was whatever kept trade flowing, and its real purpose was to circulate, to enable exchange, to put people to work and goods in motion. And if that was true, then a nation did not have to be shackled to the small, fixed amount of metal it happened to possess. A properly managed national bank could issue paper money, money backed not only by metal, but by the credit of the state and the wealth of the land. And by expanding the supply of money, it could revive trade, stimulate a stagnant economy, and lift a country out of the very debt trap that was strangling France. It was, in principle, an idea of startling modernity. In fact, it is very close to how every advanced economy on Earth operates today. But in 1716, it had never truly been tried on a national scale. It was untested, and it was dangerous, because it rested on a single fragile foundation: confidence. Paper money is only worth something as long as people believe it is. The Regent, out of options and intrigued by the possibilities, decided to let John Law try. He granted the fugitive gambler permission to open a bank that could print paper notes. It began as a modest, careful, sensible experiment, and at first, astonishingly, it worked beautifully. In 1716, John Law founded his bank, the Banque Générale, and it was, in its early form, a model of prudence. It issued paper banknotes, and those notes were backed by gold and silver, redeemable on demand. They were reliable. They were convenient. They could even be used to pay taxes. And because they were trustworthy and useful, something remarkable happened. The paper notes began to trade at a premium, worth even more than the coin they represented, because they were so much easier to carry and to use. For the first time in years, confidence began to return to French finance. Trade quickened. Money that had been hoarded and hidden began to circulate again. Law's paper was doing exactly what he had promised, putting life back into a strangled economy. Had he stopped there, with a sound national bank issuing trustworthy paper, John Law might be remembered today simply as the sober founder of modern French banking. But John Law did not stop there. He had a far grander vision, and the early success emboldened him to reach for it. In 1717, he created a company. It was granted a monopoly over trade with France's vast, largely unexplored territory in North America, the enormous basin of the Mississippi River, the land the French called Louisiana. On paper, the company controlled a wilderness the size of a continent, and John Law promoted it with genius and abandon as a realm of unimaginable wealth, a land supposedly overflowing with gold, silver, and untold riches just waiting to be harvested. The reality, as we shall see, was rather different. But the promise was intoxicating, and Law did not merely sell the dream. He tried, frantically, to make it real. His company poured money and effort into settling that distant wilderness, and it was in these very years, in 1718, that his colonists founded a new town on the banks of the Mississippi and named it, in honor of the Regent, La Nouvelle-Orléans, New Orleans. But the territory was desperately short of people, and so the company turned to darker methods to fill it, sweeping up the poor, the imprisoned, and the unwanted from the streets of France and shipping them across the ocean, many of them to sicken and die in a land that looked nothing at all like the paradise the share prospectuses had described. And then Law began to build. He absorbed France's other trading companies, its ventures in the East Indies, in China, in Africa, folding them one by one into his own enterprise, until it became a single colossal conglomerate holding a monopoly on virtually all of France's overseas trade. He acquired the right to collect the nation's taxes. He took over the royal mint, gaining control of the very production of coin. He took the tobacco monopoly. Step by step, this one company was swallowing the commercial and financial machinery of an entire kingdom. And in 1718 came the decisive move. Law's bank was taken over by the state and transformed into the Banque Royale, the Royal Bank. Its paper notes were now guaranteed directly by the crown itself. And with that, John Law stood in a position no private individual had ever occupied. He controlled the machine that printed the nation's money, and he controlled the giant company that dominated the nation's trade, taxes, and debt. Both levers, the money and the market, were now in the same pair of hands. His. Then came the masterstroke, the innovation that ties this entire story together, and the one that every financier since has studied. Law offered the holders of France's crushing national debt a bargain. That debt, remember, was trading as though it were nearly worthless. Law invited its holders to hand it over to him, and in exchange, to receive shares in his glittering Mississippi company. In one elegant stroke, he was converting the state's dead, unpayable debt into living, tradable equity in a booming enterprise. And to buy those shares, people used Law's paper money, the paper his own royal bank was printing. Do you see the shape of the machine now? The bank printed money, people used that money to buy company shares. The rush to buy drove the share price higher. The soaring share price created still more demand. And the more demand there was, the more paper money the bank could print to satisfy it, which drove the shares higher still. A single, self-reinforcing loop, spinning faster and faster, linking the nation's money, its debt, and a skyrocketing stock, all under the control of one man. No one had ever built anything like it. And then the machine did something John Law had not entirely planned for. It began to run away with itself. Through the year 1719, the share price of John Law's company did not merely rise, it erupted. Shares that had first been offered at around 500 livres were soon changing hands for several thousand, and then, at the peak of the frenzy, for as much as 10,000 livres apiece, and by some accounts, even higher. In the space of months, the value of the company multiplied many times over, and all of Paris went mad for it. That narrow street where we began, the Rue Quincampoix, became the beating heart of the mania, a churning, open-air exchange where the shares were bought and sold at a furious pace from dawn to dark. And the fortunes being made were real, at least on paper, and they were staggering. Ordinary people were transformed overnight. There are famous stories from these months of servants who bought a few shares and became richer than the aristocrats they worked for. Of a coachman who made a fortune so vast he bought a carriage of his own and hired a coachman to drive it. It is often said that the very word millionaire was coined in this frenzied period to describe the new class of the suddenly, absurdly rich. Whether or not that is precisely true, it captures the spirit of the thing perfectly. The whole of French society seemed to be getting rich together, and it felt as though it might never end. People poured into Paris from every corner of France and from abroad to join the scramble, and the frenzy around the exchange grew so intense that the price of a single share could lurch wildly between the morning and the night. The city had never witnessed anything like it. A whole society convinced, all at once, that the ordinary rules of wealth had somehow been suspended, and that anyone quick enough could simply become rich. But underneath the euphoria lay a hollow space, and it is essential to understand it, because it is the flaw at the center of this and every bubble since. The soaring share price and the flood of paper money propelling it had become almost entirely detached from reality. What was the company actually worth? What was it really producing? The answer was very little. That fabulous land of Louisiana, supposedly heavy with gold, was in truth a remote, undeveloped, and often deadly wilderness of swamp and forest, producing almost none of the riches law had promised. The real profits of the enterprise were a tiny fraction of what its towering share price implied. The value was not in the ground or in the ledgers. It existed almost entirely in expectation, in the collective belief that the shares would be worth even more tomorrow. It was a story, and everyone had agreed to believe it. And at the very moment the story was at its most intoxicating, John Law reached the summit. In January of 1720, the fugitive Scottish gambler was appointed Controller General of Finances, in effect, the finance minister of France, the single most powerful economic office in the entire kingdom. Consider what that meant. A foreigner, a Protestant who had to convert to Catholicism just to be eligible for the post. A convicted murderer with a death sentence still on the books in his own country. This man now sat in command of the whole French economy, the money supply, the national debt, overseas trade, the collection of taxes, the minting of coin. It was the most improbable ascent in the history of finance, and Law stood at the very top of it, worshipped and courted, and on paper, one of the richest men in the world. But a miracle built entirely on confidence has a single fatal vulnerability. It works only for as long as no one asks it to prove itself. And by early 1720, a handful of clear-eyed, cautious men had begun very quietly to do exactly that. The flaw was as simple as it was fatal. There was now a vast ocean of paper money and shares in circulation, and behind it all, only a small, finite amount of actual gold and silver held in the bank's vaults. As long as everyone was content to keep their wealth in paper, the machine hummed. But if enough people ever decided, at the same time, that they wanted the real metal instead of the paper, there would not be nearly enough to go around. And a few shrewd men saw it coming. Certain wealthy insiders, sensing that the share price had climbed far beyond anything reason could justify, began quietly to cash out. They sold their shares, took their paper money to the bank, exchanged it for gold and silver coin, and then carted the metal away, some of it reportedly out of the country entirely. One of the most notorious cases was a prince of the royal blood, who is said to have descended on the bank demanding gold in exchange for his paper, and then carried the metal away in a whole train of wagons, a spectacle so brazen that it announced to all of Paris that the smartest money in the kingdom had already begun to run for the door. It was the first trickle of a coming flood, and every coin that left drained the fragile reserve that held the whole edifice up. John Law now found himself trapped inside his own machine, and his response was a series of increasingly desperate measures that only accelerated the disaster. To keep the share price from falling, he had the bank print still more money to prop it up, which flooded France with paper and set off a savage inflation, so that prices of everyday goods soared. Then, in a catastrophic decree in the spring of 1720, he tried to bring the whole overinflated system gently back down to earth by ordering, in effect, that the value of the shares and the banknotes be cut sharply by official command. The intention may have been to let the air out slowly. The effect was the opposite. The decree shattered the one thing the entire system depended on: confidence, in an instant. If the government itself was now declaring that the paper was worth less than it said, then what, people suddenly asked, was any of it worth at all? And so the flood came. Panic swept Paris. Everyone rushed at once to do the one thing the system could not survive: to convert their paper back into hard coin before it was too late. But there was no coin to be had. The bank could not possibly honor a fraction of the paper it had printed. Law resorted to ever more draconian and hated measures to force the paper on people, restricting how much gold a person was even allowed to own, forbidding the hoarding of precious metal, which only deepened the terror and the fury. Crowds mobbed the doors of the royal bank, desperate to get their money out. The crush of bodies grew so violent that people were trampled, and some were killed, in the throng outside the bank that had promised them all a fortune. The share price went into free fall. The paper money became very nearly worthless. And the immense wealth that had seemed so real only months before, the fortunes of the coachmen and the countesses alike, evaporated into nothing in a matter of weeks. The miracle had run in reverse, and it took the savings of a nation down with it. And the man who had, so recently, been the most powerful figure in all of France became, almost overnight, the most hated man in the country. For John Law, the collapse was total, and it was personal. The fortune he had amassed had been held largely in the very shares and French land that were now either worthless or seized. His property was confiscated. His life was in genuine danger from the mobs who blamed him, rightly, for their ruin. And so, in December of 1720, less than a year after being crowned the master of the French economy, John Law fled France, a hunted, disgraced fugitive once more, very nearly as poor as the day he had first arrived. He never recovered. He wandered Europe again, drifting back to the gambling tables that had launched him, and he died in Venice in 1729, a poor man, in exile, remembered by most of his contemporaries as a monstrous swindler who had beggared a nation. And the wound he left on France did not close for generations. The catastrophe of his system poisoned the entire French relationship with banking and with paper money so deeply that the country recoiled from both for the better part of a century. So great was the trauma that France would not establish a proper, stable central bank until Napoleon founded the Banque de France in 1800, some 80 years later. An entire nation had been so badly burned by the promise of paper that it could not bring itself to try again for 4 generations. So let us return, finally, to the question of who this man really was. Because the easy answer, the answer of his own furious contemporaries, is that he was simply a con man, and his scheme simply a madness. And that answer misses almost everything that matters. Because John Law was not a fool, and he was not, at his core, a mere fraud. He was a genuine visionary whose central idea was not wrong. It was right. So profoundly right that it became the foundation of the entire modern financial world. Paper money that is not backed by metal. A central bank that manages a nation's money supply. A stock market. The conversion of government debt into tradable assets. John Law took all of these ideas and wired them together, working and alive for the first time in history. This is why Schumpeter ranked him among the greatest monetary minds who ever lived. He did not fail because his idea was false. He failed because he did, in 4 frantic years and with no breaks whatsoever, precisely what the central banks of the modern world now do as careful, deliberate policy. He was 300 years early and utterly without restraint. And in failing, he proved 2 things at once. 2 truths that we have never since been able to escape. He proved that whoever controls the supply of a nation's money holds a power greater than that of kings. And he proved that money made of paper and belief can conjure a miracle out of nothing at all, and then make it vanish just as completely the very instant the belief runs out. Every financial bubble that has burst since, the South Sea bubble that destroyed thousands in England that very same year of 1720, the crash of 1929, the dot-com collapse, the meltdown of 2008. Every one of them is a variation on the machine that John Law built first. And if you think this is where the story safely ends, 3 centuries ago, with a dead gambler in Venice, then look for a moment at the money in your own pocket. Every banknote you hold, every digit in your bank balance is paper money backed by nothing but confidence. There is no gold behind it. Not anymore. Its entire value rests on the shared belief that it is worth something and always will be. Which is to say, it is precisely the kind of money that John Law invented. We are all, every one of us, living inside the experiment he ran first. And it goes deeper than that. The central banks of the modern world now do, as routine and respectable policy, the very thing John Law did in a fever. When they judge the economy needs it, they create money out of nothing to stimulate trade and to prop up the prices of assets. In the years since 2008, and on a truly staggering scale since 2020, they conjured trillions upon trillions of new currency into existence. A monetary experiment vaster than anything Law would have dared to dream, and watched it flow into stocks and housing and every kind of asset. The pattern he invented is still the master template of every mania that follows. Easy money, an irresistible story about fabulous wealth to come, a self-feeding loop between credit and rising prices, a great detachment of value from reality, and then the sudden, brutal panic when confidence finally cracks. From his day to ours, it has never changed, which leaves us, 300 years later, staring at the exact same unanswered question that John Law's Paris could not answer. How much paper can you create before the belief that holds it up finally gives way? Law ran the first great experiment in pure paper money, and when the confidence broke, his miracle destroyed the wealth of a nation in a matter of months. We are all now living inside a far larger version of that same experiment, and the truth is that no one alive can tell you exactly where its limits lie, or what happens on the day we find them. In the end, John Law proved that money is a story we all agree to believe. He simply told that story better and more boldly than anyone before him. And when his listeners stopped believing it, it vanished in their hands. Every currency on earth is still telling that same story today, and still quietly hoping that we never stop believing.